You're lying awake at 3 in the morning scrolling through retirement calculators, wondering if you're ever going to make it. Everyone talks about the top 1% like it's some exclusive club reserved for tech billionaires and hedge fund managers. But here's what's going to blow your mind. The actual net worth number that puts you in the top 1% of retirees in 2026 is probably way different than what you're imagining right now. And I'm going to show you exactly what that number is and why it's not as impossible as you think. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps clarify things for you. Here's the thing. When most people hear top 1%, they immediately think of private jets and multiple vacation homes. They're picturing a number so astronomical that it feels completely disconnected from reality. But you're making a massive mistake by comparing yourself to the wrong group. The top 1% of all Americans includes 25-year-old tech founders and 40-year-old investment bankers still in their peak earning years. That's a completely different game than the top 1% of people who've actually reached retirement age. And this is where most people's assumptions fall apart. Think about it this way. When you're comparing retirement net worth, you're not competing against everyone. You're competing against people who've had 40 or 50 years to build wealth. That's decades of compound interest doing the heavy lifting. It's like comparing a snowball at the top of a mountain to one that's been rolling downhill for half a century. The retirement 1% is fundamentally different because time has already done most of the work. These aren't people who suddenly struck it rich. Most of them are people who made consistent strategic decisions over decades and let mathematics do what mathematics does. Here's where it gets really interesting. The working age 1% threshold is driven by income and active wealth building. You need to be earning massive salaries or running successful businesses. But the retirement 1% threshold is driven by accumulated assets and compound growth. It's a completely different calculation. You might be thinking, okay, so what's the magic number? Is it 10 million? 15 million? And this is exactly the mental trap that keeps people from ever reaching these milestones. You're doing math right now based on completely wrong assumptions about what wealth accumulation actually looks like over time. The compound interest snowball metaphor is critical here. When you're 30 and you invest $1,000, that money has 35 years to double, and double again before you hit retirement. By the time you're 65, that initial $1,000 has turned into something that would shock your younger self. But here's the kicker. Most people never start the snowball rolling because they assume the mountain is too steep. I spent years thinking the 1% was unreachable for normal people. I'd look at my modest 401k contributions and think, there's no way this ever gets me anywhere close. But I was comparing my current balance to a finish line I didn't actually understand. I was measuring the snowball at the top of the mountain instead of projecting where it would be after decades of rolling. The psychological shift happens when you realize that the retirement 1% isn't about being exceptional. It's about being consistent over a time frame that most people can't even imagine when they're starting out. It's about avoiding catastrophic mistakes and letting time do what time does. But before I reveal the actual number that puts you in the top 1% of retirees in 2026, you need to understand how age changes everything about this calculation. Because the threshold isn't static. It shifts dramatically based on how old you are when you hit retirement. All right, here it is. The net worth threshold that puts you in the top 1% of Americans aged 65 and older in 2026 is approximately $11.1 million. Now, before you close this video thinking that's completely impossible, stay with me, because that number tells a story that's way more nuanced than it appears on the surface. First off, yes, 11.1 million is a massive amount of money, but here's what makes this simultaneously huge and achievable. This isn't money you need to earn. This is money that accumulates through decades of consistent investing and compound growth. There's a fundamental difference between needing to make $11 million and needing to build $11 million in assets over 40 years. Let me break down why this number exists and how it shifts based on age. Because the retirement 1% isn't a single threshold. It's a moving target that changes dramatically depending on when you're measuring it. If you're looking at Americans in their 50s, the top 1% threshold is around 8.3 million. That's still substantial, but notice it's lower than the 65-plus number. By the time you hit your 60s, that threshold climbs to about 9.5 million. And for people in their 70s and beyond, it pushes past 12 million. This progression isn't random. It's driven by two massive forces: survivor bias and compound interest doing exactly what it's designed to do. Here's what I mean by survivor bias. The people who make it into their 70s with substantial wealth are the ones who didn't experience catastrophic financial setbacks. They didn't cash out their retirement accounts early. They didn't go through devastating divorces that split their assets. They didn't get wiped out by bad investments or health crises that drained their savings. The older the age bracket, the more you're looking at financial survivors who navigated decades without major disasters. And then there's the compound interest factor. Someone who's 75 has had 5 more years of market growth than someone who's 70. That might not sound like much, but 5 years of compound returns on a multi-million-dollar portfolio is enormous. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars in additional growth just from time in the market. This is why you're competing against people who've had decades to build. When you're 35 and you look at the retirement 1% threshold, you're not comparing yourself to your peers. You're comparing yourself to people who started investing when you were in diapers. The psychological shift happens when you realize that most of these people didn't start with millions. They started with modest contributions that grew into something substantial because they had time on their side. Federal Reserve data shows that the median retirement account balance for people aged 65 to 74 is around $200,000. The mean is much higher because of wealthy outliers, but the median tells you what's typical. Your 401k might look pathetic right now. You might have $50,000 saved and think there's no possible way that ever turns into millions. But you're looking at the snowball at the top of the mountain. You're not accounting for decades of additional contributions and compound growth that haven't happened yet. The 1% threshold exists where it does, because that's where mathematics and time intersect for people who made consistent decisions over their entire working lives. It's not a club, it's a destination that becomes visible when you understand the trajectory instead of just the current position. Now, let's talk about what actually gets you there. There are exactly 3 levers that determine whether you reach the retirement 1%, not 5, not 10, 3. And the beautiful thing about these levers is that they multiply each other instead of just adding up. Lever 1 is time in the market. Not timing the market, time in the market. This is the difference between pushing a boulder up a hill versus letting a snowball roll down a mountain. When you're trying to time the market, you're constantly pushing against gravity. You're trying to predict peaks and valleys, moving money in and out, paying taxes on gains, missing recovery periods. It's exhausting, and statistically, you're going to lose. But time in the market is the opposite. You put money in and you leave it alone. You let compound interest do what it does best, which is turn modest contributions into substantial wealth over decades. The snowball rolls downhill and picks up mass automatically. Here's what this looks like in practice. If you invest $10,000 at age 30 and never touch it, assuming average market returns of about 7% after inflation, that $10,000 becomes roughly $150,000 by age 65. You didn't do anything except wait. Time did the work. Lever 2 is consistent contribution rate. This is the boring millionaire strategy that nobody wants to hear about because it's not sexy. Let's break down the math. If you contribute $500 per month starting at age 30, and you get that same 7% average return, you'll have about $1.2 million at age 65. If you bump that contribution to $1,000 per month, you're looking at $2.4 million by retirement. Notice what just happened. You doubled your contribution rate and you doubled your outcome. But here's where the multiplication effect kicks in. If you start 10 years earlier at age 20 with that same $1,000 per month, you don't just get a little more. You get $4.5 million by age 65. Same contribution rate, different starting point, massively different outcome. That's time and consistency multiplying each other. Lever 3 is avoiding catastrophic, financial mistakes. And this is the one that derails more people than anything else. One major setback can destroy decades of progress. Cashing out your retirement account early to buy a car. Taking on bad debt that eats your investment capacity. Falling victim to automotive Stockholm syndrome, where you convince yourself that a $60,000 vehicle is somehow a reasonable purchase. I'm not talking about small mistakes. Everyone makes those. I'm talking about the big ones that reset your trajectory to zero. the divorce that splits your assets, the business venture that wipes out your savings, the lifestyle inflation that prevents you from ever building momentum in the first place. Here's the thing most people miss. These three levers don't just add together. They multiply. Time in the market gives your consistent contributions room to grow. Consistent contributions give compound interest more material to work with. And avoiding catastrophic mistakes means you never have to start over from scratch. You can have two of these levers working and still fall short. But when all three are operating together, the math becomes almost inevitable. You're not hoping for the 1%. You're building toward it, systematically. The difference between someone who reaches the retirement 1% and someone who doesn't usually comes down to which of these levers they pulled and for how long. It's not about being smarter or luckier. It's about understanding that wealth accumulation is a multiplication problem, not an addition problem. But here's the thing most people miss about retirement net worth. The rules change completely once you stop working. During your accumulation years, net worth is just a number on a spreadsheet. It's growing, compounding, sitting there doing its thing while you're still earning income. You're not touching it. You're not depending on it. It's just building in the background. But the moment you retire, that number shifts from theoretical to practical. You're no longer asking, how much do I have? You're asking, how much income can this generate? And that's a fundamentally different question. Let's break down what actually counts in retirement net worth. You've got your retirement accounts, your taxable investment accounts, any real estate equity beyond your primary residence, and potentially your home equity if you're willing to tap into it. All of these assets contribute to your total net worth, but they don't all function the same way when you need to generate income. Your 401k and IRA are tax deferred, which means every dollar you pull out gets taxed as ordinary income. Your taxable investment accounts have more flexibility, but you're dealing with capital gains taxes. Home equity is locked up unless you sell, downsize, or take out a reverse mortgage. Each bucket has different tax implications and different accessibility. This is where the psychological difference between having money and accessing it becomes critical. You might have $2 million in net worth, but if it's all tied up in your primary residence and you have no liquid investments, you're house rich and cash poor. That's not retirement security. That's a math problem. The concept of walking away money is what separates true financial freedom from just looking wealthy on paper. Walking away money is liquid, accessible wealth that generates income without requiring you to work. It's the difference between having assets and having financial breathing room. Here's where sequence of returns risk enters the picture, and this is something that keeps retirees awake at night once they understand it. If the market crashes in your first few years of retirement and you're pulling money out to live on, you're selling assets at depressed prices. Those shares are gone forever. They can't recover when the market bounces back because you already sold them to pay for groceries. Timing matters in retirement in a way it never mattered. During accumulation, a market crash when you're 35 is annoying. A market crash when you're 67 and living off your portfolio is potentially catastrophic. This is why retirees become obsessed with withdrawal rates. The 4% rule says you can safely withdraw 4% of your portfolio annually, adjusted for inflation, without running out of money over a 30-year retirement. So, if you have $1 million, that's $40,000 per year in sustainable income. Suddenly, that $11.1 million 1% threshold makes more sense. That's not just a big number. That's $444,000 in annual sustainable income. That's the difference between retiring comfortably and retiring wealthy. So, where does this leave you right now? Let's talk about realistic paths based on where you are right now, because the trajectory to the retirement 1% looks completely different depending on whether you're 30, 45, or 55. If you're in your 30s, you have the most powerful advantage in wealth building: time. The compound interest snowball has decades to roll. You don't need to save massive amounts right now. You need to start the momentum and stay consistent. Here's what the math looks like. If you're 30 years old and you max out a Roth IRA at $7,000 per year, getting average market returns of 7% after inflation, you'll have about $1.5 million by age 65. Add in employer 401k contributions, and you're easily pushing past $2 million without breaking a sweat. But most people in their 30s don't max out retirement accounts because they're dealing with student loans, trying to buy houses, starting families. The identity shift required is massive. You have to stop seeing yourself as a consumer and start seeing yourself as a wealth builder. That's not a budget change. That's a psychological transformation. If you're in your 40s, catching up is still very possible, but it requires more aggressive saving. You've lost some time, but you haven't lost the game. The math just needs to be more intentional. Let's say you're 40 and you have $200,000 saved for retirement. If you contribute $1,500 per month for the next 25 years at 7% returns, you're looking at about $2.8 million by age 65. Bump that monthly contribution to $2,000, and you're at $3.4 million. These aren't 1% numbers yet, but you're building serious financial security. The challenge in your 40s is that your expenses are usually at their peak: kids, mortgages, aging parents. But this is also when your earning power typically hits its stride. The question becomes, are you letting lifestyle inflation eat every raise, or are you directing increases toward wealth building? If you're in your 50s, you're in the final sprint. Time is compressed, but your earning power is probably at its maximum. This is when aggressive saving strategies actually work because you have the income to support them. You're 50 with $500,000 saved. You max out your 401k and IRA, hitting around $30,000 per year in contributions. With catch-up contributions available at age 50, you can push even higher. Over 15 years at 7% returns, you're looking at $2.2 million just from those contributions, plus your existing $500,000 growing to about $1.4 million. That's $3.6 million total by age 65. Still not 1% territory, but you're building substantial retirement security. And if you have equity in real estate or other assets, the total picture might be closer than you think. Here's what all of these scenarios have in common. They require an identity shift. You can't consume your way to the 1%. You can't lifestyle inflate your way there. You have to fundamentally change how you see money. Most people fail not because they can't do the math. They fail because they never make the psychological leap from spending everything they earn to building assets that work for them. They stay trapped in the consumer identity their entire lives. Think about cutting one streaming subscription at $15 per month and investing that money instead. Over 30 years, at 7% returns, that's about $18,000. One subscription. That's the multiplication effect of small changes compounded over time. The retirement 1% isn't a club with velvet ropes and secret handshakes. It's a destination you reach by making consistent, strategic choices over decades. It's about understanding that every dollar you invest today is working for your future self in ways that spending never will. The people who reach these milestones aren't exceptional. They're consistent. They avoided catastrophic mistakes. They let time do what time does. And they made the identity shift from consumer to wealth builder early enough that mathematics had room to work. If you want to learn the trick retirees are using to turn $500,000 into $5 million in retirement, watch this next video.